My name is Gerald Hubner. I'm from Manitoba, Canada, which is right in the center of Canada. And the 2 days of pre-conference workshop on organizational development is organized and sponsored by the Canadian Centre for Home Education, and we're pleased to be able to do that. Our objective over the next 2 days in this session is to have a discussion. We'll certainly have some speakers, but our objective is to have a discussion, which means in two directions, where we want to be able to visit with you, to share with you, and for you to share with us and all the participants the questions and the answers that we have on developing organizations. Now, when we say organizations, we certainly want to talk about what to do in a national basis in countries, but there's significant differences in the ways that things need to happen, because in some cases, education is a national legal responsibility. In some cases, it may be a state, provincial, or local responsibility. So the building of organizations at different levels, we will certainly be talking about. So the objective, as I say, is that discussion and that sharing. So please, at any point, feel free to ask questions and to interject. We will be having relatively short presentations and then an opportunity for discussion throughout each one of the sessions. Our first session today is talking about, so why would you need an organization? What will an organization do? And we'll be talking about this throughout the conference, but we want to start with those questions, and we have two presenters, starting with Paul Faris. Paul Faris is the president of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association of Canada, and more importantly, Paul is a homeschool dad and a homeschool graduate, and married to a homeschool graduate. And we're pleased that Paul can be with us and participate. Paul works across Canada with organizations nationally, but works with many organizations at a local and, for us, a provincial level. So in Canada, we're relatively small. We're a big country, but we're kind of empty in terms of the number of people. And we're looking forward to just being able to spend time and share and learn from you. So Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you to talk about why an organization, what would it do?
Thanks, Gerald. It is my pleasure to be here with you. And I know when Mike Donnelly and I were talking about this session and what we talk about, there's so much that could be covered in this sort of a session. So like Gerald said, we want to sort of give you an outline of some of the key things to think about maybe, and then really open it up for discussion. And we're happy to talk about anything. I've been doing this, I started working for HSLDA in 2003 and have been doing it ever since in one capacity or another. And it's amazing how you start to see patterns when you're doing this sort of work. It's one province versus another province. So I'll get a call from, in Canada, we have our regions, our provinces, right? And then we have our whole country. I'll get a call from one province and they'll say, someone in the government has proposed this, and you've seen it enough times so you know pretty much exactly how that's going to go, or what's behind the proposal, or what sort of groups might be pushing it. And you can really help through that situation. So yeah, I was homeschooled myself back in the day when in Canada no one really knew about it or wondered if it was even legal or not, and would you become a useless idiot if you were educated at home, or could you become functional? And then practiced at a large law firm, and then eventually came to HSLDA to do this. So I've got lots of stories I could tell you of how this has worked, and once in a while not worked, but I want to give quickly an outline of some of the key components of why you might start a national organization. And really, the first reason is an organization can solve problems that individuals can't. And there's a lot to that. So that might be legal expertise. The average individual doesn't have the ability financially to pay for a lawyer to to take a case all the way through the courts, especially not if it goes into appeal. And beyond that, the average individual doesn't know which lawyer to hire for that. So homeschooling law is very specialized. When, as a lawyer, I have to report to governing bodies for my license to practice law. And they always ask, how are you training yourself? Well, there are no textbooks on this subject. There is no other expert to consult. This is something where we actually have to read the cases ourselves, have to watch the legislation being developed ourselves. We're actually the ones helping to develop the legislation usually. So it's very specialized. So if as a home educator in Canada, without our organization, you went to the average lawyer and said, help me with this homeschooling issue, they wouldn't have a clue how to help you. And in fact, I've seen cases where instead of coming to us, someone tries to hire a lawyer and it becomes a big mess because it's so unique, so individualized that it's not just about having lawyers, it's about having lawyers who are experts on the law of the subject. There's then the homeschooling expertise issue. So if someone is starting to homeschool their own children, thinking about it, and wants to get expertise on how do you find a curriculum, or what do you do about higher studies and proving academic success, or whatever the issue may be, how do you find people with that expertise? Now, if you're an experienced homeschooler, you probably know other experienced homeschoolers. But if you're starting out, how do you find that? An organization can not only collect those individuals, build a network of those individuals, but they can make access to those individuals available to the general public. So you can put up a website, you can put flyers in your local library, whatever that method of distribution may be that's best in your country, you can make that information available to people. And even if it's just a network, I always tell people that any question you have on homeschooling, we can either solve or we can send you to the people who solve it, because it's not just us as an organization. We're part of a network of all the homeschooling resources in Canada. And so if we don't have the answer, we can get you to the people with the answer. And that is so valuable for someone starting out who just doesn't even know where to buy a textbook or a piece of curriculum. We can build relationships with officials and other people in government. This is incredibly valuable. I have found, as I've dealt with government officials, bureaucrats at every level, that most people are good people, at least in their own minds. Even people who do things that we think are bad are usually doing them for things that they think are good. And so much of overcoming bad policy or bad law or changing what's happening in a country or getting good policies in place is about building those relationships with the individuals in those positions. So there's a couple components to that. It's easy to say but hard to do. You have to know who those individuals are. Sometimes that's hard to figure out. Who in this particular government, regional, national, provincial, state, is actually making the decisions on this policy, figuring out who that is, and then getting an actual meeting with them, and then building a relationship with them, being credible in their eyes. That is a whole process, and I think in later sessions we can maybe talk about that a little bit. But building that and then helping them to understand that we care about education. This isn't people trying to get out of educating their children. What the research says on the subject, that it actually works, helping them to understand that our interests are aligned with theirs, that we all want children to be educated, but that we want to make sure that whatever the regulatory framework or requirements are, that it's something that doesn't destroy or stifle the good elements of homeschooling. And so that's a whole process. But if you're an individual, it's really hard to do that by yourself. And it also takes a long period of time, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And then, of course, the institutional expertise. Individual people come and go. I happen to have been at HSLDA for over a decade now, but that's not always the case. And I've got other staff in my office that I have trained and passed on my expertise to, and then they will pass that expertise on to others. When you establish an organization, you make it about more than yourself. It becomes about a group of people and a continuous effort that can then be, you build up that body of knowledge and expertise, and that continues to grow as people come and go. And so that takes me to my second point, that organizations can sustain an effort that individuals can't. So if you're an individual, you only have so much time. You might do something for a while, but then you have to make a living yourself. You have to do other things. Organizations can sustain that effort, whether it's continuing to pay for an expensive case, whether it's continuing to maintain a website. We see all the time with smaller organizations that one person builds a website and it's wonderful, but then they get busy and the website sort of dies off. An organization can keep that from happening. They can sustain that effort and really build on it. If it's relationships with individuals in office, policymakers, bureaucrats, whatever, they can continue that effort. And they sort of have an instant credibility, because if that person in that office has met with someone else from your organization, as soon as you walk in, you have an instant credibility, hopefully that previous person has built. Okay, so I want to give you one quick example and then pass it over to Mike, and then we'll take lots of questions because we really want to talk about what you want to talk about on this. But in one particular Canadian province, Saskatchewan, now we went through several years of effort. So I'm going to try to break this down, but ask me a question if anything doesn't make sense. So in Saskatchewan, our education policy is provincial. So Saskatchewan as a province sets its education policy. It has an education department. Canada doesn't have one on its own. And in that department, they have legislation, they have regulation, and they have two levels of policy, policy at the provincial level and then policy at the school district level. But they changed their regulation in 2012 and didn't tell anyone. We didn't know about it. None of the school boards knew about it. None of the schools knew about it. They just changed it, and it was based on consultations that had happened a decade earlier. But as an organization, we watch all those things. We watch all legal changes in the country on a weekly basis or less. It's one of the functions we fill. So we saw this right away. This was in May. Analyzed, as lawyers, analyzed this regulation. Within a few days, a new policy came out, which was 150 pages, and analyzed that, saw it, talked to the provincial organization that we work in very close cooperation with. They're more of a supportive role. We bring more of the expertise. Decided what we thought of it, then got a meeting with, I think it was the deputy minister, who's the number one bureaucrat, and the assistant deputy minister, who's the number 2 bureaucrat in the education department. Talked to them about it, understood their goals in it, realized that this was a policy that was different but could be better for us or could be worse for us. It all depended on how it was going to be interpreted by the individual school districts. So in light of this concern, what we did was we actually wrote forms that homeschoolers could use to notify and report under this policy that met all the requirements of the policy, but also allowed them to homeschool in the way that worked in their family, that was helping them achieve success. So it kept the homeschooling freedoms and the homeschooling system working well, but also met the requirements of the policy. When September came along, we had distributed this to all the homeschoolers in the province, and so most people notified with this form. Now that on itself is a huge effort, getting it out to all homeschoolers. We were able to do it because we had all those networks. They then sent it in to all their school districts. The school districts at that point didn't even know the policy had changed. There was very poor communication in the government. And so they all provisionally, sort of grudgingly accepted our forms, but said, we're going to study this ourselves, and next year we'll let you know what we think. So that sort of, we got that sort of initial acceptance of the form. Then in the spring, many of them asked for way more, and the next year and basically from that point to the present, we've got by now mostly acceptance of this form in the province. So the provincial form is the one we wrote, but each year it gets a little bit easier. So in that first year in the spring, and then in the second year in the fall, many of them wrote their own policies. Some of them were 12 pages long, 20 pages long, wanted all these ridiculous requirements that had nothing to do with homeschooling. And we were able to resist that effort, one school district at a time, and make sure that those reasonable forms were used under that new policy. But that has been a continuous effort ever since that required all these things working together. So I could talk about that more if you want, but I just wanted to give you a quick example of how these things can work together. And I'm going to pass it over to Mike, who has a lot of expertise from the States.
And I'm just going to introduce Mike, who's a good friend. Mike is a homeschool dad from Virginia and is a staff... West Virginia, I'm sorry. I'm from Canada. Forgive me, please.
I forgive you.
Thank you. Mike is a staff attorney with HSLDA and serves 8 states plus the District of Columbia. Is that right? Close. Okay. Good note.
I got rid of D.C.
Okay. But Mike is the Global Outreach Director, and when it comes to this conference, Mike is the guy. And we've just had a great time preparing the last number of years, and it's wonderful to be here. And Mike, your experience certainly in the United States, but globally as well. Looking forward to what you have to share about why an organization.
Yes. Thank you, Gerald. Appreciate it. Gerald, of course, is the chairman of our organizing board, and he's the guy. If you don't like what's going on here, you can blame Gerald. No problem. If you like it, you can thank me. No, I'm just kidding. It is so good to be here in Rio de Janeiro. You know, Gerald and I worked on the last global conference, which happened in Berlin 4 years ago, and it's so wonderful to see our old friends and to welcome new friends. We have people who have come from many, many countries, South Africa, from Brazil, lots of people from Brazil, from Spain, from Abu Dhabi, Colombia, Kenya, Russia, the United States, Brazil, Canada, of course, Australia. And I probably left a few out, so if you're from another country, I'm sorry. We'll get to know you. And we're here to talk about something that's very important. And you know, Gerald introduced me and said I'm the Director for Global Outreach for HSLDA, which is correct. First and foremost, I am a homeschooling father. That's where I started. Before I became an HSLDA attorney, I was a homeschooling dad. I wasn't even involved in any kind of organization. I just wanted to homeschool my children. And so I have to thank and recognize my wife, Patricia. Some of you know her, some of you don't. But we have 7 children, and they're from age 5 to 18. Our first is just going to college, so we're dealing with that whole separation issue. He's not dealing with it, we are. And so I started out getting involved with a state organization. It was the state of New Hampshire, a small state in the United States. And then HSLDA invited me to become one of their attorneys, and that was about 10 years ago. So like Paul, I've been working on this for about 10 years. I want to also extend a welcome to those who are watching online. If you didn't know, we are live streaming this event, and there will be people watching this after we are finished because it will be eventually placed online, and so this content will be available for years to come to benefit people. The theme of this conference, as most of you know, is that home education is a right. And I just want to say a little bit about that. As an organizing group, all of the board members, many of whom are here, we are agreed on this point that homeschoolers are a very diverse group of people. We have many differences, very significant differences in some cases. We speak different languages. We have grown up in different cultures, different education systems. I went to public school myself. I was not homeschooled. But we have something very powerful that brings us together, and that is overcomes these differences. What's more important to a parent than their child? There are very, very, very few things more important to me than my family. I'm the only person who can be the father to my children. I'm the only person who can be the husband of my wife. And so this is a very important thing that cuts across all of these differences. And so we welcome everyone here, regardless of the differences, to unite around this common idea. So talking about this idea of organization, and Paul said a number of really great things about organization and why an organization. And I'm going to start in a minute here with a video. I have a short video. It's an animation. I'm sorry to the translators because the video goes very quick, so they may not keep up with it. But can you bring up that first video, please, the animation? And this is an animation about HSLDA, the truth about HSLDA.
In fact, it wasn't even protected by laws in many of the 50 states. In 1983, the Homeschool Legal Defense Association was founded to advance homeschooling freedoms. Today, they're still at it, interpreting laws, setting legal precedents, and supporting the growing homeschool community, both in the United States and in over 70 countries. HSLDA is the only legal advocate for homeschooling with an office in Washington, D.C. From there, they actively monitor each piece of legislation pertaining to your rights to homeschool at both the federal and the state level. They then decide whether to support or oppose the legislation. Now, if you're currently homeschooling, you're relying on one or both pillars that make homeschooling legal. Either your right to choose what's best for your child, or your right to religious freedom. But if either of these rights is compromised, homeschooling falls. With the help of its members, HSLDA fights hard for your right to homeschool. Join HSLDA to protect your freedom, your family, and your future.
So this is from an American perspective, not necessarily international. And obviously the two pillars there of religious freedom and parental rights are specific to the United States. Those are two very important pillars on which the homeschooling movement in the United States grew, but there are other pillars in other countries, and even when you look at the global picture, there are other pillars as well, human rights, treaties, different domestic law as well. And so there are other important support structures for home education. But, why an organization? Why did HSLDA get started in 1983? It started with a need. And you're here because there is a need in your country, whether, Canada and the United States, South Africa. We have had organizations existing for decades serving this need. And what we found initially, the need was very simple. People were going to go to jail, or they were going to lose their children because the state was going to take them away because they weren't sending them to school. And so Paul and I are both lawyers, and we look at things from a legal perspective, probably too much so sometimes. But that was the need. And that's the need today. And I have another video that I want to show you that talks about this need. Because at the end of the day, this is really, in most places, the biggest fear that people have when they start homeschooling is it legal? And if I do it, what will happen to my family? What will happen to my children? And this is no imaginary fear. This happens. It's happening today. It even happens in the United States. So if you go ahead, and we're going to watch a short video about a family that I know very well. I've represented and continue to represent them, just to give you a little bit more feel for this issue. Go ahead. We enjoy the freedom to homeschool in America. In the early 1980s, homeschooling was legal in just a few states. Today, it's legal in all 50 states in America. In Germany, parents who homeschool their children suffer significant fines, the threat of custody action against their children, as well as criminal charges. Dirk and Petra Wunderlich's story is only the latest in a string of cases dating back over a decade that show the hostility that exists against homeschooling in some countries.
It's not only a fight for Germany. In the whole world, the governments try to steal parental rights and to crush homeschooling, and we must fight on every front.
And the Jugendamt said, tell your children they have to come with us, and they like to come with us. I say, what do you want from? What do you want from me? I say, it's terrible what you do, but please treat me like a normal human. Yeah, horrible. Yeah.
20 social workers with police support surrounded the family's home in August of 2013. Within about a half an hour, the children were taken crying into a van and transported to an unknown location.
Ultimately, this does affect the freedoms of American homeschoolers as well. The international community is used as an example to both promote and attack homeschooling freedoms. And after doing this for 30 years, I'm seeing religious freedom battles that have been fought in Europe years ago that are coming to roost in the United States today. And the same thing is true of homeschooling battles. It comes and it goes. And if we don't stand up for rights everywhere, there won't be rights anywhere.
Our example has inspired millions around the world to seek for that same freedom. We have an opportunity to help those who just want that same freedom.
Also without the financial support, it would not be possible. It's not possible for parents in Germany. It's so hard and so long, this fight. It's totally impossible. And for that, yeah, we are very happy for the support from HSLDA, yes.
Thank you for all support, and to send Mike here to Germany, we are very thankful, and thank you very much.
Yes.
Will you consider making a donation to the Homeschool Freedom Fund today so that together we can make a difference for freedom? So again, okay, it's an American audience. We're trying to get them to give us money, right? So we can do good things. That's what we do with money. When you give money to our organization, good things happen, okay? But so 30 years ago, we started HSLDA, and now In the United States, there are 2 million homeschooled children, over 2 million. Families in Germany, families in other countries need the support that only a national organization can provide. HSLDA with our partners in Canada and other places work together to help families like the Wunderlich family. I'm an American, but I'm defending them in a European court. Okay. But why isn't there a German organization doing that? Well, because there are very few homeschoolers in Germany, and it takes a lot to get an organization started, especially with the pressure from the government against it. And that's an idea that we're going to talk a little bit more about in the coming days, and especially at the main conference. We're going to talk about this idea of homeschooling as a right. But we're here to talk about an organization and trying to help you start that organization and what it takes to start that organization. So I think I've talked enough. I think what we can do now, maybe, Gerald, you can help us. We can facilitate some discussion. But when you talk about the need for an organization, that's the need, to help people who want to homeschool. Legally, number one. But after that, there are other things that come along. How? How do you do it? Some people know it doesn't matter how, they will figure out a way because it's so important. But as more people come along, they ask how to do it. And so you can answer that question. We can bring together resources to answer those questions and to provide service to specific populations within the homeschool community, whether it's people with children who have special needs, or parents who are single parents, or people who are new, or people who have other challenges. And so that's what an organization can do. So.
Thank you, Mike. We'd like to open up the floor to your questions, to your comments. And we've got microphones up here. Do we have a microphone if there are questions that... Yeah, I know I'm holding it, but we can have another one for the audience. So, if you have a question, just stand up. We've talked here about national organizations and about starting them. We certainly also want to talk throughout the next 2 days about growing, about advancing, about equipping and continuing. So, you're at various places in your organizational.
How about we ask some questions to get
Sure,
things started
let's
here?
do that.
So, what is the biggest challenge that you have in your country regarding starting a national organization? Or let me ask this: is there anyone here from a country that does not have a national or some kind of regional organization, as far as you know? Abu Dhabi? We have a mic. Do we have a microphone? Yeah. It's Rebecca from Abu Dhabi.
Hi. We have just associations, very loose. I think the Abu Dhabi Association is actually the most, the tightest organization and the most organized. But we have people all over the country that are kind of lone rangers, if you will, and I think just coming together on Facebook and forming Facebook groups, and so creating that network that you mentioned. You asked about unique situations. With us, the unique situation is that we're all expats. And so none of us have legal rights as citizens in that country. And yet, and the other thing is, as expats, we live there maybe for 2 years, maybe for 4 years. And in my situation, I've been there for we've been there for 13 years. So I've homeschooled. I had been homeschooling in Canada for 10 years before we came there, and I've been homeschooling there for 13 years. And I will be homeschooling for another 4 years, and then I don't know what I'll be doing. But the question whether it's legal in the country comes up all the time. And the irony is that we have the Ministry of Education in Abu Dhabi hiring teachers, many of them single moms, who bring their children to Abu Dhabi and then do not provide them the means to educate their children. So they're, by that, forced to homeschool. And I just find that terribly ironic that they should be hiring teachers who feel they are forced to homeschool their children. And they're aware that we're there. We have a website. We've been in the press. We've been out there, and yet there's no there's no legislation. So our strategy, if you will, is just to build rapport with the community. We go on field trips. We send usually our older children to competitions, MUN, International History Bean Bowl, that kind of thing. We actually have a rapport with the Abu Dhabi Music and Arts Foundation. They gave us a grant. And there's actually something that I want to bring up to other people later on. There's the Zayed Energy Prize, which is an international competition open to high schools all over the world. And I thought, wow, if I could tell people, homeschoolers all over the world, to enter this competition. I mean, just entering it and saying, who are these people? These are homeschoolers from Africa and homeschoolers from the US. Anyway, these are just the strategies that we've developed. And that's all we can do. We have no voice in the government. Actually, the citizens don't have a voice in the government because it's actually a benign not democracy, a dictatorship. And so what else can you do, right? But bide your time. I just want, being here is just being prepared for that time when they say, hey, what about those homeschoolers? We should do something about them. And then have something to say and hold and say, and like Paul was saying, being aware of the legislation and being prepared to respond to it. We just, in one small way, want to be prepared to do that.
Well, there are a lot of people around the world in your situation. Thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate your flying a long way from Abu Dhabi, and I know people have come from very, very far distances. There were 2 points I just want to touch on that I caught out of what you were talking about. One was when you first started, we're a loose association. And
that's pretty much all over the world.
Right. Well, in Abu Dhabi, in the country. And so I want to make a point about this. When you're thinking about starting a national organization, you have to keep in mind that homeschoolers are a diverse group, and you will have a decision to make about what kind of focus you want to have as an organization. And in the United States, HSLDA, we got started, and religion was a very important part of homeschooling in the early days in the United States. It still is. And our organization we're a Christian organization, although we serve all people, regardless of their religion or their philosophy, their political ideology, and it doesn't matter what they believe or where they're coming from. We will serve all homeschoolers. And I could tell you stories about the kinds of homeschoolers that I've served that I personally would not do or live the way they do, but when a homeschooler has a problem, they need to know that they can come and have confidence that HSLDA is going to help them. And so when you think about that, you want to keep that in mind. And at the national level, I would suggest the focus needs to be more on homeschooling, home education, and not the other things that create differences. Now, that doesn't mean, I want to hear what these guys have to say, that doesn't mean that there should not be organizations that are dedicated to those differences. There should be. But at the national level, I think the issue of education needs to cut across that, whereas at the lower level, different groups can organize topically or based on religious affiliation or different kinds of things that, are important differences, because people should have the freedom to associate with other like-minded people to travel together on this journey of home education. But at the national level, and especially at the international level, we have to recognize there are these differences, and we have to make sure that we are able to join together to work together on this important idea of educational freedom in the homeschooling context. So that's something I think to keep in mind. It's okay to have different groups, but to work together at the national level or some regional level is very important. What do you think?
Couple quick things. Is this on?
It is on.
Yeah. Okay. The organizational structure of homeschooling in Canada is basically 3 levels. So you get local support groups. That's really homeschoolers meeting and doing field trips and talking about what curriculum they use, that sort of stuff. Then we have provincial groups, which theoretically there's one provincial group in each province that puts on a big conference, does things it's a little bit harder for small groups to do, develop some relationships just with their province. And then we have the national organization, which is us. And basically I see our role as solving the problems no one else can. So if a support group can help families with a problem, that's great. If they can't, they bump it up to the provincial group. If they can solve it, that's great. If they can't, they bump it up to us. So we bring that, hopefully extra expertise. The other thing that's interesting in Canada, we were started in 1991, HSLDA of Canada. And the way it happened was we had, exactly like that example, all these small groups that were aware of each other, but no national organization and some very big problems, primarily legal. And so those early parents went to HSLDA in the States and said, can you help us start a national organization? They helped it get going, and then we became independent. And so we are very similar. The model is really the same, but it's a Canadian version of it, if you will. But I do think in some countries that, like particularly in that example, the focus probably almost has to be more, you have to convince a government that homeschooling is a national good, that it is actually good for the country. Whereas I think based on our legal structure and the history of our countries, it's been fairly easy to more fight for it as a right, which I think that's important. But in a lot of countries, I don't want to say they don't care, but that's perhaps less of a legal right to fight for that. It more becomes a matter of convincing them that if they allow this mode of education in their country, it will make their country stronger and more prosperous and be a good for them as a government and for their citizens. And that can often be where a lot of the focus needs to be. That's going to be different in every country, and we want to help you figure out the solution that works in your country.
Question over here.
Yes, can we have a microphone for Lee? I'd just like to recognize Lee Portance, who is one of the sponsors. Classical Conversations is one of the main sponsors of our conference, so it's great to have Lee here. She's the founding mom of Classical. I hope you don't mind me saying that, Lee. The founding mom of Classical Conversations. Classical Conversations is one of the fastest growing companies that serve homeschoolers with curriculum and opportunities to come together in tutorial settings on a weekly basis. So we're very glad to have you with us, Lee.
Thank you. And it's on? Okay. So for these organizations that are trying to do something on a national level, you've talked about education freedom. Is that kind of the catchword that that you think they should operate around, or is it more parental freedom? What's your emphasis? Because to me, if you're talking about education and home being a choice, it makes it sound like it's a building versus the rights of families to be united and for the parents to make the decisions. So I just kind of wondered what were the better words to use in helping them develop these programs.
How much time do we have left?
We've got 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll take a quick crack. You want to take a quick? Why don't you go first? I went first last time.
I'll just be really quick on that. I think that's not for us to answer. I think each country has to decide that. And the right answer is not only for you to decide, but is going to be different for different people in different countries.
I would say that when you talk about educational freedom versus family freedom versus parental rights versus child's rights versus states' quote-unquote rights. By the way, states do not have rights. So when you hear people talking about state rights, this is my view of human rights. States do not have rights. Individuals have rights. And so you've touched on a very a sensitive issue, Lee, a little bit, because it is culturally driven. But there is a debate at the global level about educational freedom. And they use the word educational freedom because it captures a lot of different elements that you've talked about. It includes, for some, children's rights is important. The United States is the only country that has not ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And if you wonder why, I'd be happy to tell you. Not right now. We have very good reasons for not ratifying it. But every other country has. So when you talk about children's rights, that's a set of rights. Now, parental rights are also very important. In fact, parental rights precede the children's rights because they're written into international human rights treaties that go back to 1950. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is 1989. So there are parental rights already in human rights law, international human rights law. Then the children's rights comes later. And so, the words you use will depend on who you're talking to, where you're talking, when you're talking. And so when we're out there advocating at the national level and at the international level, we have to be aware of these somewhat political issues because it is political. Paul was talking before about, schools and control and sort of getting in that direction. And so, in the U.S., we have a constitution that recognizes the rights of parents to direct their children's education as fundamental. It's a fundamental constitutional right. Precedes the UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights by 25 years as a written declaration that parents have a fundamental right. Universal Declaration on Human Rights, Article 26.3 says parents have a prior right to decide how their children are educated. And so, I don't think you can just neatly say we just talk about parents' rights, we just talk about children's rights, we just talk about educational freedom, but it depends on where you are, who you're talking to, who you're trying to influence at any given point in time that will determine the words that you use, and those words are important. I think we're done.
Thanks, Mike. Good question, and there's a significant amount of discussion around this whole strategic approach that we'll be taking. I'll take one last question or comment from Leendert from South Africa.
Thank you, Gerald. Yes, I just want to confirm what Mike says. Every country has its own structure of laws, and different rights have different weights in each system. And what you're going to use will depend on what will get you what you need. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Leader.
We have to be pragmatic. We have to be practical. At the very fundamental level, we are ideological. We are ideological in that we believe the idea of home education is a fundamental right of importance, and we build on that ideology, that idea, that belief. But as we try to influence and seek the different things that we want, legal recognition, in some places, some countries will want government funding. This is a big issue of debate within the homeschool community. In the United States, it divides some people. Some people say, we don't want your money, leave us alone. Other people say, we want the money because we can't do it if we don't have the money. And so it's a matter of debate. And so it's going to depend issue by issue. But at the end of the day, we have to be pragmatic and practical and sensitive to the context in which we are discussing the issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Paul. Appreciate. We're going to have lots of more opportunities to talk about virtually all of these things, but we'd like to move along, and I'll let Mike and Paul step down. And our next presenter, we're taking a little bit of a step back, not talking even about the specifics of national organizations, but a broader perspective. Davis Carmen is our next presenter. Davis Carmen, number one qualification, homeschool dad. Davis comes from the United States from North Carolina. And Davis has an engineering background and has worked in many different organizations, but I think for this particular audience, I'll highlight two. One is that Davis has been involved with the North Carolina Homeschool Association for many years on the board, and now leads a homeschool publishing company, Apologia, that is one of the sponsors of the conference. And Davis, we thank you for that support, and very much appreciated. And we would like to hear from you some of the things that you've learned in your journey in starting various organizations, that as somebody is looking at starting, growing, building, advancing an organization, what are some of the steps and some of the things that people need to be planning for? So, Davis?